And with that, let's go ahead and get into the meat of today's report, which is on color revolutions. Before we do, we're tracking 65 protests today. Again, most of these are going to be pretty small, but they are spread out across the United States. And this is within baseline of what we've seen over the past few months here. Now, for this, Robert, welcome back. Yesterday, we talked about this article from this outlet called Notice, Notus. It's like a nonprofit type. It's a journalist outlet. What exactly is this group?
So it's News of the United States, and it is a media outlet that was started by the Al Britton Journalism Institute, and that's Robert Al Britton, who was one of the founders of the parent company of Politico. And it is a nonprofit, and the idea is to incentivize experienced journalists to come to their outlet and leverage their connections to produce journalism like this.
Mm-hmm. You know what's funny? Anytime I see a nonprofit journalist outlet, I think of like ProPublica and some of these others, and they're quote unquote nonprofit. They say they're non-biased, but you look through their articles, and it's all anti-Trump stuff. They never take a magnifying glass, or rarely, if ever, take a magnifying glass to Democrats. So you really wonder, how nonpartisan are they? Obviously they are. At any rate, you read through this article. It's all about how these current and former federal employees are either providing training or getting training to build basically a resistance movement against the Trump administration. What did you learn from this article, and what were your takeaways?
So the primary people they talked to that they named were involved with this group called Democracy AID or Democracy Aid. So far, they don't have like a website or any kind of legal filings under that name. And apparently for specific reasons because these people said that they believe the Trump administration already knows this is happening and have been taking steps to try to prevent exactly what the goal of this group is, which they've started doing invite-only workshops to train current federal employees in these non-cooperation tactics. They've been networking with other anti-Trump activist groups or pro-immigration activist groups. One of them, the founder of this Democracy AID group, is a former USAID official named Danielle Rafe. And she's also involved with some other activist groups. She sits on the board of a group called Grannies Respond, which is one of those protest organizations that uses grannies to go out to protest to provide both a information operations angle and also act as effectively shields against police response for protesters. And one of the things they did point out is that one problem that these former USAID and State Department employees are having trying to organize with these already existing groups is that some of the leadership of these groups assume that they are agents provocateur because of their experience overseas. So they are currently organizing or attempting to organize these groups, and they also pointed out that they have their vision ahead toward that 2028 May Day general strike call from UAW President Sean Fain. And my general impression of these groups is that they are using the USAID playbook to try to organize as many groups to get involved with that, around that potential May Day general strike.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, coming up in 2028. Robert, you're I think the only person I've seen really talking about that, which is that for years now, UAW President Sean Fain has urged other unions, labor unions, to negotiate an end of their labor contracts, to end on the 1st of May or around the 1st of May. That's May Day, International Workers' Day, in order to set up this national general strike coming up in 2028. And, this was the biggest reasons last year when I was looking, and I said, okay, obviously Trump is almost certainly going to win the election, and the left is going to respond in various ways. One of the things they're going to do is start building a resistance movement in hopes of building the momentum and turning that into a potential revolutionary movement, like a color revolution. And it's one of the reasons why I didn't think the Royal Rumble is going to happen this year. I still don't, obviously. But 2028 is like, kind of mark your calendars. not only is it an election year, but typically color revolutions tend to occur around elections. Any further thoughts before we get into this PhD level dissertation on color revolutions?
No.
Okay. All right. Well, I would just add, first of all, thanks for reading through this article. I read through it as well, and one of the crazy quotes on here is from an anonymous former USAID employee, and he said, "quote The Trump administration here." This is what he's talking about. He says, "quote But they've done a very foolish thing," and he's talking about by disbanding USAID. He continues, "quote You just released a bunch of well-trained individuals into your population. If you kept our offices going and had us play solitaire in the office, it might have been safer to keep your regime." One of the things that you and I have talked about as USAID was being gutted is this a Paul Bremer moment, right? We go back to just after the invasion of Iraq and the Saddam regime was toppled. And Paul Bremer was the ambassador. Actually, I think he was head of the coalition provisional government or something like that at the time in Iraq. And he said, look, we have this major problem because we have a standing army, which I think was at that point something like the fourth largest army in the world. He said, we have this standing army that's filled with potential Sunni insurgents, and we do not want them getting military equipment. And so he fired them all. And what happened directly after that? You have tons of people now that don't have jobs. They're probably already opposed to the U.S. occupation of Iraq, U.S. invasion of Iraq. They have nothing to do. They have no way to get paid, no way to feed their families. And all of a sudden, you have a bunch of insurgents on your hands. Yeah, there's obviously a similarity cutting these people loose. And now they're doing what they're doing. And honestly, we should just be thankful that this Notice group, this Notice media outlet actually published this article, because Democracy AID or Democracy Aid was previously kind of a shadow group. I haven't done a deep dive into them yet. We should probably do that today, Robert. But heretofore, I've never even heard of this group before, and now it pops up on this article. So there's obviously some level of them moving from more clandestine to more overt type of activities if they're voluntarily going public now with their organization and what they're doing. So something we will definitely keep an eye on. Thanks for that, Robert. We're going to move on now here to talk about this color revolution and this burgeoning color revolutionary movement. In order to do this, we have to dissect what we're actually looking at here. And people talk about the left as if it is a monolith, as if every leftist believes the same things. And that's not at all the case. So broadly here, when I talk about the left, I'm really talking about probably three different factions of quote unquote the left. And moving from the far left of your screen, that's the revolutionary left. So these are the abolitionists, the people who want to abolish police, abolish prisons, abolish the church, abolish capitalism, abolish the government, et cetera, et cetera. And these are the anarcho-communists and all the various flavors of left-wing anarchists here. That's the revolutionary left, and we'll talk about this here. Actually, let's go ahead and talk about it now. So these are in addition to Antifa there, but we've got everything from Democratic Socialists of America, DSA, to the Party of Socialism and Liberation on the I hesitate to say the right side of this, but and then we've got Communist Party USA, Revolutionary Communists of America, the Revolutionary Communist Party. So various flavors of socialists and communists, and then finally we've got the true revolutionary left. When we look at the far left part of this, these are the people who want to abolish government. When we look at Communist Party USA, PSL, DSA, they don't want to abolish government. They want to take it over. And that's one very important distinction here between groups like Antifa and groups like PSL or DSA. And then moving a little more centrist, we have the progressive left. So this would probably encompass a majority of the Democrat Party at least. And then we have the quote unquote moderate Democrats or the reformers. And this is where the distinction gets made. The left side of the left, they're revolutionary. The right side of the left are reformers. And when Lenin talks about the right wing, he's talking about the right wing of this left back then in the Bolshevik Revolution. He's talking about the reformers. He's talking about the quote unquote the right wing of the left. And so Lenin today would view moderate Democrats as the right wing. And that's why we get, anything to the right of the right wing of the left is obviously just fascism. So that's their argument. So at any rate, when we're talking about color revolution, we're talking about the reform part of the left. We're talking about the people who don't want to abolish the government. They just want to take it over. And that's the distinction that I make between broadly the revolutionary left, the actual revolutionary abolitionists, and then the reform part of the left. And so that looks something a little closer to that. So with that, let's go ahead and get into what this color revolution campaign actually is. So Democracy Aid, or Democracy AID, they talked about this non-cooperation campaign, which is a resistance campaign. This is what we're talking about here. And in that, they want to use predominantly nonviolent tactics. That's not to say there will be no violence. There obviously will, but predominantly nonviolent tactics. Nonviolent tactics are going to be their primary tactics to attack or otherwise undermine the legitimacy, authority, and capacity of a sitting government, in this case, the Trump administration. These are the three pillars of governance. If you are a revolutionary, if you're trying to foment a popular revolution, or what's colloquially referred to as a color revolution, you're trying to undermine the legitimacy, the authority, and the capacity of a government. In a best case scenario, like looking out to 2028, a best case scenario, this group and others like it, because there are many of these types of groups, are going to use tactics like civil disobedience to try to grind down the gears of the Trump administration and prevent them from, as they see it, becoming authoritarian. In a worst case scenario, the leaders of this resistance movement and all these assorted non-governmental organizations, these NGOs, decide to foment an actual popular revolution, again, colloquially known as a color revolution, to topple the Trump government and replace it with a sacred democracy. So briefly, a color revolution is a type of irregular warfare. So we're not talking about conventional war here, not tanks and bombers. This is irregular warfare. And they want to use predominantly nonviolent action to topple an existing government. And they usually do this through things like mass protests and demonstrations, civil disobedience, and public displays of mass political defiance. That is the key word here, mass political defiance. You read Gene Sharp's pamphlet or manual on color revolutions effectively. It's called From Dictatorship to Democracy. And he said mass political defiance is the vehicle by which you get to overthrow authoritarian regimes. That's what they're pushing for. That's kind of like item number one that we have to understand. They want mass political defiance. They want somewhere between 12, 20, 50 million people engaged in mass political defiance. We'll talk about that here in just a second. So some people may ask, well, why do this nonviolently? It's kind of counterintuitive. How can you overthrow a government like the United States government without weapons? And there's a lot of reasons why they want to do this. I mean, we look at insurgency, which is a violent armed attempt by irregular forces to overthrow a government. We look at an insurgency, and insurgencies on average last something like 10 years. And so that's just an incredibly long time. And there is also no certainty of victory. The left could lose if they do something like that. And it just has a massive death and casualty toll. So instead, what they want to use, instead of hard power, they want to use soft power, which is kind of like social power, to resist, embarrass, frustrate, and undermine the legitimacy of the Trump administration and then force it from power. This is something that they were building back in 2020. You remember that group called Shutdown DC? Someone got into one of these Zoom planning sessions, these video conference calls, and they were saying if Trump wins the election or if Trump stays in office legitimately or illegitimately, we're going to shut down DC. we're going to shut down the economy, and we are going to grind the gears of the economy down and force a crisis for Trump and say, the only way that we will allow you to alleviate this crisis is by stepping down. That's exactly what they were planning. That is effectively a color revolution. That is what these people are ultimately planning as a worst case scenario. So this is much more than just political warfare, but it is also less than a military coup or armed revolution, which again, I don't think this flavor of left actually wants. The goal of a color revolution is to topple an existing government in the shortest amount of time and with the least amount of human suffering. It's one of the things that Gene Sharp says in many of his books. And Gene Sharp is credited as the father of the color revolution. He's probably done, I think he's probably the most respected author. That's not exactly the term, but he's considered the father of like nonviolent revolution / color revolution. A lot of the color revolution stuff that we see today is exactly that. It's based off the work of Gene Sharp. So all this, what I'm trying to get at here is that all this precludes armed violence as the primary tactic. There obviously will be armed violence, but it will not be the primary tactic. Because again, the average length of an insurgency is 10 years, carries a high death toll. There's no assurance of success. And there's also very severe repercussions for failure. A color revolution, on the other hand, once it is launched, is typically over in weeks to months. We're talking like 2 to 4 weeks, 6, 8 weeks, something like that historically, and comparatively has a much higher success rate than insurgency with a far lower death toll. And so if you're in these circles, you don't want to kill the host. You want to take it over. And so color revolution is really the best course of action for them. It is the best course of action to get what they want, to get their objective. So let's go through this very briefly, talk about legitimacy, authority, and capacity, the mechanics of how this actually works. So you have armed revolutionary violence, and that is used to attack the military capacity of a government. A color revolution, on the other hand, is coordinated strategic use of soft power. And that is power that's used against the 3 pillars of governance, and they are legitimacy, authority, and capacity. A color revolution, or these revolutionaries, attack legitimacy by turning the people against the existing government towards an alternative shadow government or government in waiting. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. It attacks the authority of a government or a dictatorship, which is what they would call it, by encouraging people to openly disobey the government. So you are undermining a government's authority. Laws only work because they're generally respected. And when people stop respecting authority, laws no longer have the intended effect. And that's effectively what they're going for here. And then finally, it attacks capacity by sapping the revenues, sapping resources, sapping manpower that's required to carry out these government functions. And so if you're a government, if you're a Trump administration, and you have a lack of legitimacy, you have a lack of authority, and you have a lack of capacity, you're really not a government at all. Maybe you're a government in name only, but a government that lacks legitimacy, authority, and capacity is going to be replaced. And that's why color revolution is so effective. It can be relatively bloodless. So one of the most important things we can do to anticipate the future or anticipate what comes next is by identifying where we actually are in this phase of a burgeoning resistance movement currently, and possibly a color revolution attempt much closer to 2028. So a color revolution has 3 basic requirements. Number 1, you have to have powerful non-governmental organizations, so powerful NGOs that are capable of developing a strategic plan and organizing and directing a resistance campaign or multiple resistance campaigns. So powerful NGOs capable of organizing and directing resistance campaigns. That is the very first prerequisite that a color revolution absolutely has to have. The next is you need popular dissatisfaction, because that is what creates a foundation for mass resistance and eventually a revolutionary rupture. So if you want mass resistance, you've got to have a mass of the people involved. And we call that popular dissatisfaction. And then lastly, you need a shadow government or a government in waiting that is capable of coming in and resuming government functions, resuming that government authority once the previous government has been forced from power. And then also that government in waiting, or shadow government, has to be recognized as legitimate once it assumes power. And again, this is a worst case scenario, but this is exactly what we've seen play out in many countries around the world. And so those are our three prerequisites. And so midway through 2025 here, let's just take an assessment of which of those three indicators we see. Does the United States have powerful NGOs capable of developing a strategic plan and organizing and directing resistance campaigns? Yes, obviously, Democracy AID is one of them. We just talked about them. The next thing is you need popular dissatisfaction. And in this case, it would be popular dissatisfaction with the Trump administration. Now, popular, you may have heard that name before, as in like popular support, or in this case, popular dissatisfaction. It's a pretty vague term. What actually is popular? A lot of people think popular means a majority of a people, majority of a populace, or majority of a country. That's not the case at all. I had this professor freak out because I was talking about popular revolutions, and he said, there could never be a popular revolution in the United States because a majority of the Americans are not going to go with it. And he completely misunderstood what the term popular actually means. So it does not mean a majority of the country. Popular only means a substantial portion of the overall populace. So there are certain protest organizations today, and you can go back, Indivisible is one of them, and you can go back to the work of Gene Sharp and Frances Fox Piven. We'll talk about her in just a second. And they cite kind of this doctrinal understanding that 3.5% of a country could form a popular movement. Was it 50-51, I think? That's one of the groups, one of the protest organizations, national level. And 50-51 stands for 50 protests in 50 states on one day. That day was April 17th, I want to say, was the first big national day of protest. But they continue to plan and organize and carry out these national days of. There were first national days of protest, then there are national days of action, and then there are national days of resistance. So we're seeing again, all this stuff exists on a spectrum. Okay, all this stuff, it happens in phases, and when you start calling your movement a national protest movement, and then you say, "Oh, we're going to have a national day of action," and now you say we're going to have a national day of resistance, they're pushing these people down the spectrum. So at any rate, a lot of these people say, look, you only need 3.5% of a country that's actively involved in a resistance movement to carry out this popular revolution or this color revolution. That would constitute a popular movement. In the case of the United States, that's roughly 12 million people. That's about 3.5% of the country. So they want 12 million people. Now, if you look at the April 17th, I'm pretty sure it was April 17th, National Day of Protest. Or, excuse me, I'm sorry. It was April 5th. And they did another one on April 17th. And then there was May Day. And then there was that June 14th or June 17th was the last National Day of Action. And they said they got maybe like 5 million people involved in that National Day of resistance nationally. So they need 5 million people actively engaged. Or excuse me, they need 12 million people actively engaged. They turned out 5 million just to protest. Okay, so that's another metric. You want to say, how close are they to actually kicking something like this off? They need 12 million people. They've got 5 million people. Okay, so I think that's a very important metric there. Another way to look at popular dissatisfaction, because that's what they need. Is there 10 to 20% of this country that is dissatisfied with the Trump administration? Yes. So if you're one of these protest organizations or one of these resistance organizations, a community organizer, one of these NGOs that's trying to build this movement, your goal is to get at least 3.5%, if not 5 or 10% or more, 20% of a country actively involved in resistance or opposition. So I think they are pretty close. I guess let's go back. Is there 10 to 20% of the country that opposes the Trump administration or that's dissatisfied with the Trump administration? Of course there is. So I do think they have technically achieved popular dissatisfaction although it is far from a majority. Again, it's a vague term, but this is the textbook term. The last thing we need to be looking for is there a shadow government that is emerging? And I would say not overtly. And if it's not overt, it's certainly not legitimate. So there's still a long way to go on that. We may not see necessarily a shadow government form, or we may not see a shadow government take an overt form, but it doesn't mean that it's not there, or it's not trying to be built behind at a more clandestine level. So those are the three prerequisites of a color revolution. When we start seeing that in more concrete forms, we're going to be much closer to something like that kicking off. And again, this takes years to build. One of the things that's in this Notice article, they say, you got to start off slow. Go out as a group and go get ice cream. And that's in one of the sections of the article. You have one of the leaders, the co-leaders of Democracy AID, saying, go out as a group and go get ice cream. And people are like, why are we going to get ice cream? We're trying to build a resistance movement. And they say, that's part of the organizing. That start off slow, that is part of the organizing. So this is extremely early. We can also look at the work of Frances Fox Piven. And yes, she is the Piven half of the Cloward-Piven strategy. If you're familiar with that, Google it. She wrote a really great book. And when I say great book, I just mean it's extremely insightful. But the book is called Challenging Authority. And it's about how to use social power to challenge government authority. Basically, how to build a resistance movement or how to build a revolutionary movement. And she outlines 4 lines of effort for a popular revolution like this. One of the things is the 4 lines of effort are, number 1, building a broad coalition of activists. Is there a broad coalition of activists in the country? Obviously. Next is mass mobilization protests. Have we seen mass mobilization protests? Yeah, probably 3 to 5 million on the 2 biggest national days of protest. Yes, we have seen that. The next thing is mass civil disobedience. We have not seen this yet. This is what they're trying to build. And then lastly is strikes and economic disruption. That was certainly being planned in 2020. Those plans, it's not like they've gone anywhere. The people that made those plans, it's not like they've gone anywhere. All that stuff's still around. All these people are still around. We have just not gotten to that point yet. But as Robert and I talked about at the beginning of the segment, Sean Fain, the president of UAW, is trying to organize labor unions to have a general strike in 2028. It's another reason why we should expect this to probably happen in 2028 and probably not before. It could happen before, but probably not. So at any rate, if you go by Frances Fox Piven, we've seen 2 of the 4 lines of effort being achieved. So I look at these 2 ways. I think they're great gauges to determine where this resistance movement is, how advanced it is, and we're still in the beginning stages, number 1. But the next thing we need to start looking at is how close is this resistance movement to becoming a capable revolutionary movement? And they are inching closer. They're obviously not there yet. So broadly, a resistance and then a revolutionary movement foments revolution by moving the mass of the people from some level of active or passive support or acquiescence to some level of active or passive opposition or defiance. And I show this on the screen here. All the citizens of a country fall somewhere within this support to defiance spectrum. And again, a government doesn't even need active support. It doesn't even need passive support. It just needs acquiescence from people to survive. And when you take that active support away, you take that passive support away, and most importantly, you take that acquiescence away and move the mass of the people into opposition, non-cooperation, or defiance. You have a real revolutionary movement on your hands. And we're not talking about 100%. Just think about, I look at like general elections, and they say, what is it? 7% of the country actually elects the president. 7% of voters, depending on which side they vote for, will elect a president. When you move that 7, 10, 15, 20% of a country from relative neutrality or from acceptance into opposition, you've got a real revolutionary movement on your hands. And so this is another gauge that I look at to determine how close we are or how close we could be. So as you can see on this spectrum here, non-cooperation, that is the stated goal of shadow groups like Democracy AID. Non-cooperation is firmly within that resistance and revolutionary paradigm. This is inherently a resistance and revolutionary group. And that's kind of the second big takeaway for everyone. We actually are dealing with this. If this were a game of baseball, I'd say we're probably in the third or fourth inning, because we do see some overt indicators. Okay, these are the building blocks that we're looking for, the building blocks of a resistance and revolutionary movement. The majority of the game, though, is still ahead of us. And again, I would say ninth inning is probably going to be late 2028, maybe early 2029, depending on how that election goes. Let's take a look here at this revolutionary pyramid, or excuse me, the color revolution pyramid, or the popular revolution pyramid here. Roughly, we're looking at 4 phases of a color revolution. And we start at the base there, which is symbolic resistance. Listen, I know you can't read all that stuff. I'll have this slide and this whole report for Forward Observer members. By the way, if you'd like to join our intelligence platform, you can do that starting today at forwardobserver.com. We produce this report every morning. We also have intel updates throughout the day on this type of stuff and the things that matter, that almost always do not get reported by the news. At any rate, we start with symbolic resistance, and this is relatively low-risk actions, like that first National Day of Protest on April 5th. Pretty toothless. It's a low-risk action. So protests at government buildings, small demonstrations against symbols of power, they pose absolutely no threat to a government. But they are used to gauge popular support for political opposition, because if that National Day of Protest had 10,000 people show up, obviously they're not even getting the ball rolling. But they had at least 3 million people show up, which is significant. And so that is one way to gauge popular support for that popular support for that movement. But it also builds legitimacy for a resistance movement, because when you can continually sustain millions of people turning out to this protest, it shows you have staying power, and that gives you credibility, and that makes people more likely to join you when they know that you have that level of credibility or that level of authority. It also builds confidence for larger demonstrations in the future. And once you have achieved that symbolic resistance, once you have popular support for symbolic resistance, you can move one rung up on this ladder, this pyramid, to selective resistance. After you have a resistance or revolutionary movement and you have gained support from a substantial portion of the populace, they view you as a legitimate protest organization or as a legitimate movement. Again, you gain that support and legitimacy through symbolic resistance. Then you can begin engaging in selective political defiance. And these are actions like civil disobedience, such as sit-ins and occupations, boycotts, sustained demonstrations that garner media attention, and actually begin building pressure against the government. One really great example of this is all these members of Congress trying to barge into these ICE facilities. That is an example of selective resistance. It's exactly what that is. We have not gotten, I think, to the brunt of the civil disobedience phase, but it is coming. And once that's normalized, this is the big thing. You have to normalize this type of resistance. And once it is accepted, once it becomes routine, then you can move the mass of the people, because it's going to be much safer once that becomes normalized, much safer to do. And when there's a lower risk, you're going to get more people engaging in that lower risk behavior as opposed to fewer people engaging in that higher risk behavior. And now you're moving into mass resistance. And so again, when selective resistance has the support of a popular portion of society, again, we're not talking about majority, but 10, 15, maybe up to 30% or more, a resistance movement can begin into coordinated, targeted, and again, nonviolent strategic action, because that's what a popular revolution or color revolution is. Remember, it's predominantly nonviolent. They do not want to be getting in running gunfights with the government, because they're obviously going to lose. I mean, that ICE thing, and this was bad enough, but that ICE thing on Friday, you got 10 far left militants, and you got 2 rifles and 2 rifles had zero fatalities. You have 1 police officer who was unfortunately shot in the neck. So you have 1 casualty, 2 rifles, 10 Antifa militants. That's not a real great batting average, luckily. I mean, thank God. They do not want to get into an armed conflict. And I think that's a really good example showing they don't have the cards. That's why many people on the left want to keep this beneath the threshold of any type of armed conflict. And again, color revolution is how they do that. So at any rate, this nonviolent strategic action are going to be things like national strikes and boycotts, something that we can expect in the future. Large-scale disruption to economic activity. So we're talking about road blockages. We're talking about occupations and sit-ins, targeting ports or targeting commercial facilities, this is economic warfare, trying to induce economic friction, because that is a point of leverage to use against the government. But all this stuff, grinding down the gears of economic activity, attacking or undermining civil society, these are forms of mass political defiance. It's going to take a lot of people to do this. That's what's called mass defiance. But it is designed to damage a government's legitimacy, capacity, and authority. Again, this is one way they do this. And then finally, when you grind down the gears of an economy and you say, we are simply going to stay here, and you could come shoot us, sure. But that's more likely to cause more backlash. And I'm just telling you their theory here. I'm not saying this is the ground truth. It really depends where you are in this country. But once they start doing that, they start building strategic leverage for themselves. And they simply tell the government, you're an authoritarian, you don't have legitimacy, you don't have authority over us, and we have reduced your capacity to govern. We've reduced your capacity to fulfill your obligations. The only way that you can resolve this is by stepping down. And again, I'm just telling you what their theory is. And then eventually you might have a government that does step down because they realize they're not going to win against this color revolutionary movement. And then that's when you get transition of government power. And so through each phase of this pyramid, a resistance movement and then revolutionary movement is building legitimacy for alternative institutions, especially a shadow government or a government in waiting that is capable of stepping in to fulfill government functions once that previous government has been forced from power. And so I'm not saying we will, but if we get into 2028 and we start seeing visible manifestations, we start seeing overt indicators that there actually is a shadow government in waiting, people need to be extremely concerned when that starts to happen, because that is an indicator of what comes next, which is attempts to force a sitting president from power or sitting government from power. You know, sometimes I talk about this stuff. I say, Mike, that sure sounds really extreme, man. I'm not sure we'll ever get there. I'm not sure that could ever happen. And honestly, I just think that's a lot of normalcy bias talking, because as Americans, we've never seen that kind of stuff in our own country. But these people are obviously serious. These people have done this in other countries, and now they're overtly talking about doing it here. There's just so many examples of these people saying, we're going to do this here if we need to. And they may feel like they need to in somewhere between, say, November 2026, January 2027, into 2028 and 2029. So this is not something that I expect to be imminent, but it is building 100%. It is building. The chief goal here is to convince a mass of the people, to convince a mass of Americans that the Trump administration is illegitimate. If they can't do that, we're not going to see this move beyond mass resistance. We're not going to see this push to remove President Trump from power. If they can achieve that over the next roughly 3 years, if they can achieve that, and they can influence a majority of Americans to believe that Trump is illegitimate, then we probably will see this. And it may not even be Trump. It may be the next, whoever replaces Trump on the Republican ticket. If they can convince people that that election was not credible, or that election was fraudulent, or that election was stolen, then we will see the top of this pyramid happen. if a Republican candidate wins and there's a JD Vance or whoever that's going to be, and there are allegations that are seen as credible, perceived as credible, that was a fraudulent election, this is exactly what's going to happen. So with that, we do have a couple of other items to hit.